This is Lost for Words, which is my talk for Birmingham Indies about localization. My name is Andrew. I have been a games programmer for almost 20 years. I've localized a ton of games in my time, and I'm currently one of the lead programmers at Row 7. And today we're going to talk about, as you guessed, localization. We're going to split it into 3 general areas. We're going to talk about preparation, how to set up your game so you can localize it well, and what choices you need to make at the start. We're going to talk about text, because a large part of localizing is how you deal with text. What are the pitfalls that you can fall into? What are the mistakes to avoid? And we're going to talk about shipping, how at the end of your game, do you actually pull it all together and produce something that's localized for players. But if there's one thing I really want you to take home from this talk, it's the following: that localization is not just translating. It's not just the act of putting something in a different language. The Globalization and Localization Association defined localization as the process of adapting a product to a specific market. That is, making that product have the look and feel of being created specifically for a target market, no matter their language, cultural preferences, or location. And notice there, language is only one of those things. Localization, by the way, you'll often see it written online as L10N, which is because there's 10 characters between L and N, and even between British and American English, they can't decide on how to spell localization. So just make it easier for everyone, often people call it L10N. Let's look at some examples of things that aren't just text. This is a zine from Gone Home that you can pick up and look at. Now, if you're a French player and you pick this up and you see this, you're going to know that this game wasn't localized for your target market, because it'll be English writing. Similarly, if you're playing BioShock and a Spanish player picks up an audio diary and hears English words coming out, then they're going to know that this game wasn't made for their target market. And a Korean player might boot up Hades, see there's a Korean option, put it in, and then notice that not all of the glyphs of Korean, not all the characters of Korean have been rendered properly because the fonts weren't set up correctly. And then just data, even when you're not dealing with just text itself, data, many different countries will render numbers differently. They'll put separators in different places. It's always confusing to me when I go to the continent and shops put commas for decimal places. Currencies might be rendered with symbols and the start or the beginning with different money separators. Most of us will know that Americans have a real fondness for putting the month first in a date. But did you know, for instance, that in Germany, they traditionally do year-month-day? I didn't know that. And will your game know that? Will it render dates correctly to German players? Or will German players be like, oh, this is obviously an English game that's been translated? Even times, I don't know why Danish people put a KL in front of the time, even when it's 24-hour clock, but they do. And if you don't do it when you enter time, if you've got the language set to Danish, then Danish players are going to know. So we've identified some things that aren't just text, but now let's talk about how you prepare your game to be properly localized. And before we do that, we're going to have to set up some terminology. One of the pieces of terminology we're going to talk about is locale codes. And these are a 4-letter code separated by a hyphen, which represents a language on one side, according to ISO, the ISO list 639, and then a country code that comes from the ISO 3166 list. Some examples of that might be NGB, which is English in the UK, or we can infer British English then from that. And then if someone has chosen this as the locale, we should show them English text, and we should render dates in the correct order. However, if they chose NUS, which is American English, you would still show them English text. Maybe it would have slightly different translations, but you would show the dates in a different order. Something that we're going to come back to a lot during this talk is that languages are complex. There's a lot of very subtle, complex points when you're dealing with different languages. And this is why we pay localizers, because they are specialists in this stuff. But for instance, when we're talking about locale codes, ESCS is Peninsular Spanish, that is the Spanish that they speak in Spain, and ESMX is Mexican Spanish. These are different languages. Some people might be able to get by if you showed them Mexican Peninsular Spanish, they might be able to get by, but they're going to think it's weird and they're going to think you've done an incorrect job. If they select just Spanish from the drop-down menu and it wasn't clear that this was Peninsular Spanish, they might be a bit irked. But this can even be a bit political. For instance, ZHCN is simplified Chinese, which is the very common language that's used in mainland China for printed and digital assets, including video games. However, people in Hong Kong or Taiwan, which is HK or TW, they would prefer to use traditional Chinese. And to some of them, it might be a political decision if they want to do this. And they might be greatly offended if you only offer them Chinese or if you only offer them simplified Chinese. So you have to take these type of things into consideration when you're deciding on your locale codes. Now, choosing your locales is probably a whole talk in itself, but the bottom line is it's going to cost you money to localize into a particular locale. And so the cost of doing that has to be less than the profit you think you gain by selling in that locale, by selling to people in Hong Kong or Taiwan, for instance. Yeah, I've never been involved with this stage of choosing locales. It's very much sometimes a publisher decision. However, like the easy version is essentially to go look at your competitors on Steam or whatever marketplace and see what languages they've chosen and hope that they've done their homework. One common group, basically your Pokemon starter set of languages for Western developers is EFIGS, English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish. Basically, you should assume you're doing this at the very, very least, and that will get you access to most of Europe and North America. Another common collection of languages you see is CJK. This will include both traditional and simplified Chinese, as well as Japanese and Korean. And other languages you might see very commonly ported to include Russian, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, which is different again, Danish, Polish, Turkish, and so on. Fonts are a very big topic, but the very first thing you need to think about when you're choosing your fonts for your game are the licenses. It can be very easy to get the TrueType font file for whatever font you've found on some Google search. However, just because you've managed to get the TTF file does not mean you have a license to use it. And you have to look very carefully to make sure that it's legal for you to ship this in the game. Sometimes it might cost you some money. Sometimes it might be free. Sometimes it might not even be available for sale at all. That's beyond the scope of this talk as well, but be aware that it's a thing. The next thing when choosing a font is glyph coverage. Not all fonts are created equal. They might not have, for instance, if you're doing CJK, they might not have access to all of the Korean glyphs or to all of the Japanese glyphs. Most tool chains will give you a system where you can set up a series of fallover fonts. So if you're rendering in some language, it doesn't have the glyph you need, you can fall back to another language which does have that glyph. That lets you somewhat have your cake and eat it, because you can have the very fancy, pretty font that you want for your main UI, but then in other languages, you can either load a different font that has glyph coverage or fall back to that font when necessary. And again, the basic Pokemon starter of fonts is Google Noto, which is entirely free, entirely open source, and its very design ethos is to contain almost all language glyphs. So you can get different variations for different languages, and you can know if you chose Google Noto as your font, you would have the ability to render almost any language you wanted to render and have good consistency of your glyphs throughout the game. You'll probably look at this, and this is the Android font, so you see it very often on Android. And I don't know about you, but often when I play Japanese mobile games, it seems that they use Google Noto almost by default. And I think it's very common in the Western industry to do that in reverse, to use a fancy font for the Western players and then use Google Noto as the fallback. So maybe it's like their version of revenge. Tooling. I got annoyed with one of my programmers on the project I'm on at the moment when we started localizing, and they said, oh, I've got a localization system that we can use. And it was just a dictionary lookup. It was just like, here's a text file. I'll look up the string for you. And I got slightly annoyed because it's a way more complex problem. Like, good tooling is way more productive to you when you're localizing than just a simple dictionary lookup. And here's some of the things that it can do for you. For instance, it can auto-select a locale on Steam and on consoles and on mobile. You're able to interrogate the OS and say what language is the OS set in, and then auto-select that. In fact, on consoles, it can be a TRC failure for you not to auto-select the locale. So you'll have to write that code if you don't have a good toolchain that does it for you. and you'll have to test it on all the platforms. Loading only needed assets and fonts. You don't want, again, fonts can be very, very large. When they've got all those glyphs from Japanese is a huge language. All those glyphs loaded into memory can be a huge drain. So if you're not rendering Japanese right now, having a way for your tooling system your localization tooling to unload that font is very, very useful. Testing. We're going to talk more about debugging and testing later, but your tooling should provide a way for you to easily check that your game has been fully localized and that everything fits in their text boxes. Import and export. You need a way of getting stuff from your in-game assets, from your Unity game engine or from Unreal, out to the localizers, and then having them localize it and then have it come back to you again to be imported. Depending on depending on the route you choose for that, it might not be trivial. Iteration time. Is it easy for your UI person to add a new label to the game and then have that instantly be listed in the translation, in the localization system? Or do they have to click through 4 different dialog boxes to get it into the game? Dynamic text. Not everything is going to be fixed text. Sometimes you're going to want to say, you're going to want to describe the hit points on a character or the color of a procedurally generated piece of clothing. You're going to need a way of producing dynamic text. And does your localization tooling make that easy? And many more. There's so many more things we could go into. Luckily, both of the big major game engines have support for this. On the far left, there is Unity's new localization package, which is just called Localization with a Z. We've already shipped that on one Roll 7 game, and we're shipping it on the Roll 7 game that I'm working on right now. It does have a learning curve, but it's very powerful. It has a lot of really interesting features. I2 localization is a very popular one from the asset store. Gordon was talking about how he's using that right now. I've used it in the past. Again, it has a learning curve, but again, it's very powerful. It handles a lot of problems for you. And then Unreal has a built-in solution too. So whatever game engine you're using, you've probably got a solution out there. If you're rolling your own engine, maybe there's something you can find that's open source that you can add in. Or if you feel like it's worth the investment, roll your own, but just be aware that it's not a like afternoon's work. It's more than that. So having said that, localization is not just translating. We are going to spend a bit of time talking about strings and how to deal with them. Strings to a programmer just means text if you're non-programmers here. Let's look at some of the problems from earlier. So this zine from Gone Home that we talked about, and the audio diary here. Now you could spend money and you could localize that zine asset. So there's a French version and a Spanish version, and it makes sense to everyone. And you could do really expensive extra voiceover for those audio diaries for different languages. And I'm sure the AAA developers do that. But, and I'm going to offer you several times a cheap and tacky solution. If you want to do it, you could just, for the zine, have a text overlay, have some subtitles like thing at the bottom that describes to the French player what they're looking at. And for the audio diary, have some Spanish subtitles so the Spanish player can listen and understand what's going on. They're going to know that this game hasn't been designed for their individual use. And maybe you're fine with that, but it will save you a lot of effort. And when we're dealing with text, we need a way to refer to this text in the code. So we're not writing the English in the code the whole time. We need something symbolic. We need a key. And so this column on the left is the key column. It'll be, it can be anything you want. Often it's a single, it's lumped together like this. So it looks obviously like non-English sentence. And your code will ask the localization system, please give me the text for help crystal for this user. And then it'll go and it'll know that it's currently localizing for the Netherlands, and it will go look up the correct translation for that and give you that text back, which you can then present to the user. This is, by the way, the Triple Town mobile localization sheet, which is a mobile game that I worked on in 2014. It turns out I still have Google Cloud access to. So I hope that they don't watch this talk and then sue me. But it means I can show you some actual localization data that's not my current game, which would be heavily NDA'd. So keys are how we're going to refer to stuff from now on, is how we're going to represent text. Google Sheets, by the way, is a very good option for sending your text out for localization because it's cloud-based, so you can dump into it and localizers can instantly be working in the sheet at the same time. It has version control built in, so you can click and see what changes have been made since you last imported the text. It has comments in it, so localizers can ask questions about different translations and what this might mean. It's just very useful. It's a very good default choice if you haven't got any better options to do this. Some places do, like big budget AAA studios do have specific software that can deal with localization and do a better job of handling localization with localizers. But almost all localizers, without fail, not like I will say every single localizer you deal with, every professional localizer you deal with will know how to work with Google Sheets and will be fine if you work in Google Sheets. Let's talk about some gritty details of text. Let's say we've got this example string where we've got a procedurally generated mission in the game called that you have to build a cathedral. However, the building name could be anything. It could be build a hut, build a mansion, build a swimming pool. How are we going to localize that? First of all, we're going to definitely use keys. We could have like 40 different keys for all the different building types. But also what we could do is split it into two keys. We could have an achievement build key, which represents the builder part. And we could have the cathedral key, which represents the English text cathedral. And then we could just take the two of them, and in programming terms, this is called concatenation. We just join those two strings together and they become one string. And this is the naive approach, and it looks like it works. However, I don't know if you've heard this, languages are complex. And this is not going to work for all languages. In Turkish, you'll have to trust me that this Turkish translation is wrong. Cathedral there should be at the beginning of the sentence, because their verb and noun order is different. I don't understand the vagaries of it. I just know that it's complex. So how do we solve that problem? We don't want to write in our code that's generating the mission, is this Turkish, in which case concatenate it on the front instead of the end. We want to offload all of that knowledge to the localizers. They're the experts in this. Let them worry about it. And the way we're going to do that is through parameters. So we can change the achievement build text to be builder, and then Unity's system here uses a curly brace, zero curly brace, but every localization system will have a way of dealing with this. We're going to say, please localize achievement build with parameter cathedral name. And then the localization system will do a search and replace. It will search for curly braces, zero curly braces, and substitute cathedral name in there. And this means that in Turkish, the Turkish translation achievement build has the curly braces at the front. The localizers were able to put that there, knowing where it should be. And then it successfully inserted cathedral into that string in the correct place. So this looked like correct text to Turkish people now. So parameterize. And this is why one of the reasons why localization late on can be really hard, because you'll be surprised at how much of your game is doing string concatenation and how hard it can be. It won't be as simple as this, where you can just do two different keys. It might actually be really hard to try and pull concatenation out and put parameterization in. And so there's a saying that you've seen the internet meme of the best time to localize your game was the start. The second best time is now. Here's another problem with localization, pluralisation. Here's a string. We want to tell the user how many points they have. They might have 1 point or 5 points or 0 points. Now, let's assume you're not going to do the really, really dumb thing of just appending an S to the end if it's more than 1 point. Let's assume you're going to do, like, there's a really obvious key-based approach to this where we have a score singular and a score plural, and the text, the code is saying if points is 1, then we're going to use the score singular string and pass in number 1 as a parameter. If it's anything else, we'll use the score plural key and we'll pass in 1 as a pass in the score as a parameter, and we'll get the correct text out the other end. This seems brilliant. We can pass these off to localizers. They can change point for the correct singular and plural in their language. However, it has been said, languages are complex. And this won't work for all languages. Because some languages, I'll get to this point, but some languages, for instance, Russian, have different pluralizations for few and for many. I think few is something like 1 to 2, or 2 to 4, and 12 to 14, and 22 to 14, and 22 to 24, and so on. And many is like 17 or 15 to 17. I think this is right. I don't know. I'm not Russian because I pay localizers to understand this stuff for me. But that means you actually need a pluralization for singular, you need a pluralization for few, you need a pluralization for many. You're not going to understand that and write that into your code. So again, how do we solve this? The cheap but tacky solution, we've talked about cheap but tacky solutions already. This one is to just rearrange things like this. And your Russian localizers will make this work. It'll make sense to Russian people without looking nonsensical. However, just like this to you looks a little bit lazy, that version to Russians will also look a little bit lazy. There is a way we can solve this with modern tool chains. Unity system does something like this. So our curly braces exist here. And then we've put our 0 to say take the 0th parameter, which is our points. And this keyword plural says that the next two things are going to be the singular and the plural translations. And the curly braces there are saying where we should put the points in. This is great for English. This means we don't have to write anything in our script to say if 0 points use this key, if 1 point use this key, if multiple use this key. We don't have to do that at all because it's all baked into the single localization key. So we just take score and we pass in the parameter, and the localization system will understand which one of these two translations to use depending on the value of the points. But the Russian version can look like this. It has more options because Russian supports few and many. So this is the few and this is the many translation. You can see they're different words to singular. And again, we didn't have to understand this in our game code. We could just pass in the points value and then the localization system sorts it out for us. Gender. Here's a complicated one. You want to say the item is color, and you've parameterized this because you're clever and you've listened to the first half of this talk and you've said, we're going to use the key item name and the key red color name because the item is red. However, let's say it with me, languages are complex. And this, as you may have guessed, doesn't work for some languages with gendered nouns. So in Spanish, you actually need two keys. You need L item, and then if it's masculine, it will be L. And if it's masculine, the color will be rojo. And again, for feminine, la would be for a feminine item and roja for the red color. So you need to swap both of these things out. And it looks like a complicated problem. And it's super hard to get this right and super involved and complicated, and only really AAA devs do it. So when I say the cheap and tacky solution is just to shrug it off and be like, let the localizers figure it out somehow, understand that a lot of games take this route. And while it might irk gamers, at the same time, it is a solution that they've seen before. But modern tooling can do this. Here is how it might work in Unity's localization system. You can say the red translation can have this choose parameter, and then whether we're choosing male or female, it can do the different translations for red. And then for the item description, again, we're passing in the item. We're saying get the gender from the item. We're saying choosing male or female. We're changing the definitive article here. And then we're passing the item color. We're getting the item color out from there, which passes down to this thing. You can already see how this is like 2 or 3 layers deep already to get this single string. And on top of that, you're now going to have to get, in some way, expose the genders of your nouns to the localizers so that they can fill it in for the correct languages and then re-import them into your game. And this is why most games sort of be like, well, we haven't quite got the budget to fully tackle this. It would be nice if we could solve this, though. It does pain me that I've shipped games that don't handle this properly. And just because I've been messing around with Unity's localization system a lot, I wanted to go in a little bit into how its parameters are actually super useful and in a way that I've not seen before. So they have this concept of sources and formatters for parameters. And a source is something that you don't have to, whereas before we've talked about parameters, we're saying localize it with this parameter. I'm giving you the key and I'm giving you the parameter, sort it out, join them together. Sources are a way for you to say there's a parameter here, and the text in the string is responsible for going and finding what the parameter is. And then a formatter is responsible for taking something that already exists and then changing how it's rendered. It's easiest if I give an example of that. For instance, this is a source here, input _ select is a source that when the localization system sees it, can go off into the game engine and find the actual enum that represents UI select. So then that curly brace becomes containing UI select. After the colon is the formatter that says glyph. And when the localization sees glyph attached to an enum, attached to a control enum, it can go off and find the correct glyph that's bound to the controller for this input. So for instance, here we're getting press the start button to continue, and you're seeing a picture representing the start button. And this is fantastic. This can be per console. It can be dynamically bound to different controls. So if the user rebinds this to RB, you'd see RB here instead. It's really super flexible. I really like it. We're not passing in a parameter input select to this. We're letting this string itself create its own parameter and then consume it and render it in a certain way. We can go even further than that. So we can have a different formatter, input jump :name. This formatter pulls out the localized name for input jump. And then we'll also have the localized glyph for input jump. And then we get a localized string out the other end that says jump and says space, and it's all localized together. And you can go even further and actually pass in a parameter of the game action you want. So you have only one line in your localization database that's name : glyph. And then you're always passing in the correct action that you want to render. And then the game spits it out the other end. So if you want to change every single place in your game that shows a tooltip, you can change that in just one row in the database and have that reflected all over the game. I really like Unity's sources and formatters. I think they're really interesting, and I wish more toolchains did this sort of thing. Now we're going to talk about shipping. This is how you pull everything together at the end of the project and get everything sent off. Now, this is invariably something we do later on in the project, because you actually have to have most of your game written to have all the English text together so you can send it off to be localized. But before we get to that, if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this section, it's that please don't use Google Translate ever, ever. If you think, well, Google Translate is pretty good, so I can just use it and then I can get away with paying a localizer for, excuse me, for, I don't know, French, it's not going to work. You've already seen some of the keys that we're dealing with are relatively short, abstract words. If you ask Google, please Google Translate point for me, so you can render 5 points, it doesn't know if you mean the verb to point at someone, or if you mean the noun points, the score in the game. And not only does it not know, but when it gives you the answer, you won't know which one it gave you. And you're not going to go through your whole game and manually check everything. And you don't speak French, because if you spoke French, you translate it yourself. So just trust me that Google Translate will never give you good output, so you should never ship it. Secondly, some people like to Google Translate their game to begin with, so they get a feel for what things will look like in the final, when they finally got final translations in. And I also think this is a bad idea, because invariably you'll accidentally ship Google translations, and you won't know to look at your game whether this is a Google translation or a real translation, so you won't be able to tell. So just please never do it. If you need to see your game, see your final translations in the game, there are tools and cheats I'm going to talk about in a minute that might help solve those problems too. Let's talk about the milestones, the road that you're going to walk in the last third or so of your project to get it localized. First of all, you need to book your localizers. This is not something you want to do super late on, because they need to have availability and they need to fit with your deadlines. For instance, we're talking to localizers. We talk to localizers about 2 months, about 8 weeks before we need them. We start booking localizers. So that's about the time frame you're looking, about 2 months. And that's, we deal with generally the same localizer. So we're just going back to the first one. If you need to shop around a bit, you might need even more time to negotiate with people. So give yourself about 2 months, maybe more. The next milestone you're going to hit is your English first draft. You think you've got all the English text in the game, and you think it's pretty much what you're going to ship. You get all that together, you get it in your spreadsheet, you send it off, you get your first localization. Your first localization is not an event, it's a process. There's going to be lots of back and forth. We're going to talk a bit more about that. But after that, you'll have some localized text. And you can then go through your first integration, which is getting that localized text back in the game and fixing all the problems with it. And we're going to talk about some of the problems you might encounter. Once you've done that, You might have some back and forth. You might have had reason in the 2 or 3 weeks it's taken to do this integration. You might have had reason to change some of the English text. So we'll generally do an English lock at this point. Absolutely, from this point onwards, we cannot change English. At that point, you pass it off for final localization. You get your final localizations back, integrate them, which should go much, much smoother, and then you can ship your game. Let's talk about the first localization. Again, this is a process, not an event. Here's some of the problems that you could encounter. First of all, you need to know that you've fully localized everything. You need to know if you're playing the game in English the whole time, how are you going to tell whether an English string you're seeing is a hard-coded string that someone's left in the game or something localized that's coming from the localization system? In the past, I've written cheats which have returned. So when you have a key and you ask the localization system, please get me the translation of this key. Instead, the cheat would say, at that point, it would intercept it and just return the key. So your UI would just be made up of all the keys that represent the English strings you should be seeing. And that way, if you see any localized text, then you know that text. If you see any English, then you know that that English has not been translated yet because it should be represented as a key. This works pretty well, but Unity's actually got an even better process. They call these pseudo locales. And what you actually do is change the locale of the game from English to this cheat locale. And you can see it kind of mutates all the text. It puts brackets around things. It uses accents in weird places with the intention that when you're looking at it in English, it's still readable and the game is still playable, but you can obviously tell when something has been not localized because it will be much more plain English. The other advantage of this is it actually also works with parameters. So for instance, if you had a string that was equipped, but someone had hard-coded handax, in my original cheat that just returns the string, you would have said, show me equip desk with the parameter handax. It would have just returned equip desk, which would be what we rendered on the screen. Whereas with Unity system, it would localize the equipped string and then insert handax. And so you'd see handax in plain English and you see equipped in weird accented English. And that way you would know handax is hard-coded. So I much prefer Unity system here. One other problem you're going to get with localization is ambiguous question. Just like when we're talking about Google Translate, there are ambiguous words. There's going to be ambiguous phrases. And so the localizer is going to want to know here, maybe they can guess. When the key is score, they can guess. But as an example, they're going to ask, does this mean points or does it mean point at or does it mean number of points? And again, Google Sheets is great here because people can add in comments, you can reply to comments, all that stuff stays in the spreadsheet so future localizers can see that information too. So this is why this first process can take a while. It's not going to be fire off an email and a week or so later you get back a dump and everything's done. Once you get stuff in, a classic problem you're going to encounter is label overflows. So here's Spanish rendering outside of the bounds of this UI label. Now, there are a couple of ways we can solve this. We can either increase the size of the UI label. We can have it dynamically scale with the text, so it fits for both a short English word and a long Spanish word. You can have the text shrink, so it renders slightly smaller. That can have accessibility repercussions. Or you could go back to your localizers and say, this doesn't fit. Is there a shorter phrasing that still makes sense in Spanish that we could use here? This is entirely possible. If you want to have a head start on this kind of thing before you go off for localization, there's a number of ways you can do this. One of them, this is Unity's solution for it. You can write your own as well. I've written my own in the past. It's just taking the English text and then extending it out. And so you see we've instantly got the overflow problem. With Unity's version, you can customize this to make it really extend stuff or to shrink stuff. And you'll be able to change locale to the extending locale, and you'll be able to play your game and figure out where stuff might be problematic before it ever goes off to localizers. Line breaks. Japanese has no spaces in it, which often UI rendering, text rendering layer engines will use spaces as a hint as to when they can line break if something's overflowing, like it did in the previous screen. However, Japanese can't do that. You can't just arbitrarily line break in Japanese. It breaks the wording. Now, there are a number of ways you can solve this. Unity's Text Mesh Pro says it has a solution that has a number of hinting files it uses where it can kind of guess where the best place to do a line break is. I don't speak Japanese. I can't tell you how effective that is. Another option is you can go back to your localizers and say, I need a line break for this. Where should it go? But it's just the final example of how line breaks are super weird, how languages are super weird. That's it. Let's recap some things for you. Localization is more than just translating. It's more than just strings, even though we spent a lot of time talking about strings. You have to think about voiceover assets, graphical assets. You have to think about date rendering, number rendering, all those things. You need a good tool chain. It's not just something you can knock up in an afternoon if you want to do a good job of it. You should prepare early. Like I said, the best time to localize is the start of the project, and the second best time is now. It will be, if you know you're localizing and you have the tool chain set up, but you're still building your UI in English, you're just making yourself double the amount of work. Parameterize everything. Much easier to go back and localize parameterized stuff later than it is to try and turn concatenated stuff into parameterized stuff. Trust me, I've been doing it for a few weeks now and being super annoyed by how much concatenated stuff is in our game. Use debug tools. Try and find non-localized strings. Make sure you have a way to find non-localized strings. Make sure you have a way to find overflows. And then finally, you can find me on Twitter. Thank you very much, everyone. There's some text popping up. If you've got questions, you can either ask them in text or you can unmute and ask them. Is anything anyone, or comments, things you disagree about me, things about the talk you disagree with?
I can partially agree with you on Google Translate, but also Google Translate has, I think someone else has also commented, Google Translate has advanced over the years, and for the example you use of like if you just put in points and you get the translation, it does actually provide you a full list of the different translations for the word point, depending on the definition that you want.
Well, that's very nice to know. That's good.
So yeah, I wouldn't say, but yeah, I'd agree on not replacing a localizer with Google Translate because on the basis that a localizer will understand the nuances of a language much better than an AI ever could. So, but for individual phrases, I can understand. I would be more willing to get away with using Google Translate. It's just as long as you don't just copy the first translation you see.
My question would be that maybe that was a bad example, because you see if you saw lots of the examples of strings that were heavily parameterized. There was something like, is a parameter do a parameter, and is Google Translate going to be able to deal with that, or is it just going to fall over? And will you know if it's dealing with it or if it's falling over? That's the thing that worries me about Google Translate.
I can give you a funny example of Google Translate if you want, used in a game.
Yeah, please.
I speak Spanish, by the way, so I'm not making this up. So they were using it because, budget. And, in English, the word back is, like to go back in the game, but also your physical back, right? Yeah. The part of your body. So they use Google Translate, and in every part where you had to go back in the game, they would say espalda, which is the body part. So it was really weird.
It's amazing.
You won't know. Google Translate doesn't take, context. It's difficult. It's going to be difficult to, where is this in the screen? What's around it? It's an image. How do I, know this should be atrás instead of espalda?
Exactly, yeah. You only have to, once you go through localization with localizers once, and you see how many questions they ask about context and about phrasing and about consistency, about like, if you have a particular noun for your, I don't know, your magic system, your mana, say your mana is called mana everywhere. A good localizer will make sure when they translate that, they pick a translation for mana and then they use that consistently. And Google Translate, again, might be inconsistent about it, and you might not even know. Fan translations too are something I didn't really touch on. Genuinely, in general, they're frowned upon, because they're seen as exploitative. But also for the developer, there's no accountability because you don't know, someone might very kindly be translating your game for you and you've given them the files, but you don't actually know what they're translating it into. And you could be putting anything out there and putting your name on it. James asked, what do I think to a visual scripting like node graph system for this in the future? Do you think it would be easier than large regex looking strings? Think about independency and changes based on gendered nouns. Yeah, I think I'd want to see more about that. That sounds, I'm a big fan of visual languages in general. However, most of your localization at this level is going to be done by programmers. They're going to be perfectly happy writing curly brace strings with a bit of substitution in them. Things like that gendered string I showed you earlier are obviously the very, very heavy end for that. And even I, having read the docs, found it quite hard to parse that stuff. So maybe some kind of visual debugger. I've seen regex debuggers before where you can put regex in. Regex, for people who don't know, is it's basically a programming language for searching strings. But I've seen that it's very complex and very compact. And I've seen debuggers where it would break that out into a state machine, break that out into basically a visual graph like James is suggesting. And maybe something like that you could have inside Unity's localization system or whatever tool chain you're using, where you could paste your curly braces thing and then it would show you and help you debug it would be very useful. Anyone else have anything they want to talk about?
Can I throw you a hand grenade, Andrew?
Yeah, please.
Have you ever done any Arabic languages?
Yes, right to left.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, there are lots of languages. I mean, like Japanese is traditionally written right to left, right? But in, I think it's kind of from what I've been reading, it's generally accepted left to right Japanese is readable and accepted by people. However, something like right to left Arabic does not make any sense left to right. And it's not just as simple as putting text into, like getting it translated and then rendering it on the screen. Everything will break if you try that. Unity's Text Mesh Pro, maybe you've been doing, like our game isn't being localized into Arabic, which is why I didn't talk about it in detail because I haven't touched it for years. But maybe you're doing Arabic right now, Gordon. You can talk more about how Unity's supporting it.
No, not really. On the previous project, we did some interactives for a museum in Saudi Arabia, so there's a lot of Arabic. Yeah, the right to left stuff, yeah, completely breaks your brain. And also there's various rules about how certain characters combine, which all has to be done dynamically. But when you look at it as a non-Arabic speaker, it kind of looks all right. And so you're like, oh, I think I've just about done it. And then you show it to somebody who speaks the language and they're like, this is just complete gibberish. Yeah, because, with French and German, you can at least take a stab at take a squint and go, that's probably okay. That sort of looks like what I expect French or German to look like. But yeah, very foreign languages. It's a total pain in the arse. I mean, there's plenty of tools out there, again, Unity and various plugins, but yeah, it's something you've got to be aware of early if you're going to do it. But I'm not sure how actually common it is to localize games into Arabic at the moment.
Yeah. I know that Unity has, Text Mesh Pro has support, which is Unity's text rendering system.
Yeah.
Localization toolchain has support for it. I'm not using it right now, so I can't quantify how.
Yeah, that's a there be dragons, I guess. If you're ever going to have to do it, be aware of it and get on it early and try and get somebody who can help you that speaks the language, I guess.
Desiree's asking about chat in game, and I guess user entered text of any kind. So leaderboards are another example of this. If you have user profile names rendered in the leaderboards, you actually need to support you might need to support all of those Unicode characters, and it could be anything that they're inputting. And your best choice is just to go with, like I say, something like Google Noto, where you've got really wide character support, and make sure you have that set up as a fallback. So you can use your language, your font, which you think supports most of the languages rendered in your game. And then for user text, use something like Google Noto. So you've got really good character support. But it is like the best choice is just not to have, the cheap but nasty solution is just not to have chat in your game, and to do heavy sanitation on user input so that they can't enter things that you can't render.
Thanks.
Correct me if I'm wrong now. Noto is a range, a family of fonts, and not just one specific font, though. So presumably you'd have to choose which Noto you wanted to use.
Yeah, you can get Noto slim or what's it, compact and bold, and yeah.
I mean between character sets of different languages.
Yes, yeah. So you get the bunch that you want, and then you set them all up in a fallback chain. So you get the Korean one and the Japanese one or whatever.
Yeah. I should say there are some cases where, say you have English text within, say, Japanese text. Japanese people would expect those Latin characters to be rendered in a particular way in their scripts. That might tend to be simpler than the way that they will be rendered in an English script, a Latin character script. That's worth mentioning. That's
a good point. How do you get around that problem normally?
It's a hard one, really, because you probably have to put English. I guess if you were using if Japanese was the primary language, then you would perhaps have English as the fallback rather than as the primary. Maybe.
Yeah, when you change the look, because when you change, often games I've worked on have been set up in such a way that you'll change locale and it changes all the primary fonts. So you can unload those unused fonts partly, but also you could use this. So when you change to Japanese, you could set up the Japanese font first and then put English as the fallback. Yeah. So the Japanese font has its simplified Latins, and then you can use the normal window. Yeah, you get it.
Yeah, makes sense.